interesting discussion. Lynne Harne is a long-time lesbian feminist activist and a founder member of the Lesbian Rights Alliance. She's published on lesbian feminist politics, lesbian mothers, and male violence against women and children, and she was an active member of Lesbians in Education in the 1980s, where we kind of thought we'd won something before it was all rolled back. She is also an angry lesbian grandmother.
I've got two granddaughters, both of school age, and one of my concerns, I'm going to be talking about how schools erase lesbians, and one of my concerns is that both of them may never know about the positive possibility and freedom of being lesbians, because by the time they get old enough, just being able to say the word lesbian may have disappeared. And I'm going to start off looking at, Deville has talked about being a tomboy, and many lesbians have been tomboys, and I'm sure many lesbians here have been tomboys. I myself was a tomboy, and at about the age of 4 I asked my parents to buy me a cowboy outfit and a cat gun, and that was in the 1950s. Up until a few years ago, it was accepted in primary schools that girls could be tomboys. They could have short hair, wear trousers, want to play with games and toys that have now been defined by our male-dominating culture as masculine. But nowadays, this is highly unusual. For example, it is virtually compulsory for small girls starting school to have long hair and to wear feminine clothes. So much so is this true that, as reported on Mumsnet, a mother who took her daughter to her first day at primary school with a short haircut and wearing trousers was asked by her class teacher what pronouns should she use with her daughter. The mother was totally shocked. She had not confined her daughter to traditional feminine stereotypes in clothing or in the activities that she did, and she told the teacher this. However, the teachers at this school apparently did not agree. 2 weeks later, her daughter came home from school telling her parents she wanted to be a boy. This school had obviously not engaged in challenging highly gendered stereotypes for young girls, and had gone along with trans ideas that girls are naturally born feminine. And I was going to say, I also was going to do a PowerPoint and show you some slides here, but I can't. But basically, it's getting worse and worse in terms of compulsory femininity for girls. And I mean, if you just look at the toys available for girls and so on, and sort of things like makeup dolls for 2-year-olds, princess costumes, all of these things that girls are expected to want to do. Toys, all toys should, girls' toys, girls should be making ornaments, girls shouldn't be doing adventurous things and so on, despite some, Lego changing a bit. It's getting far, compulsory femininity is getting far worse. In some schools, if girls do not want to be confined by what we can now call compulsory femininity, which we all know here is a social construct, they're told that they must be boys. We know that in some early years education, teachers specifically look out for children that could be considered trans, observing what they play with, whether they play with the appropriate girls' and boys' toys. and whether their playmates are boys or girls. So if a girl is seen as, you know, one of my granddaughters, her best friend in school is a little boy, you know, that is can be considered inappropriate. And we know from Mumsnet, coming on to young lesbians, mothers who are now contacting the Lesbian Rights Alliance, that teenage gender non-conforming lesbians are not being supported to be lesbian in many schools. Instead, they're allowing these girls to experience sexist, misogynistic, anti-lesbian bullying from other students, which most schools continue to fail to address. We know now that many young lesbians who come out of school and the lack of positive affirmation of their sexuality acts as a trigger for them to decide to transition. Being a lesbian has become, for these teenagers, has become highly stigmatised amongst female teenagers, and it is viewed as old-fashioned and uncool. And instead, trans ideology persuades these girls that they are really men born into the wrong body, the body of a woman, but with the brain of a man. So being a trans man is presented as something which is progressive and even revolutionary through trans social media sites. And once young lesbians go into these sites, they become part of a cult, and a cult-like group where they are welcomed and supported to become and stay in this cult and put on the road to transition. And the influence of these youth trans sites, if you want to call them that, they can't be underestimated, because all young teenagers are highly vulnerable to being influenced by their peer groups and things. For them, it's often something that's very hard to resist. I would say, though, that they are probably totally unaware how outdated the idea that a lesbian is really a man in a woman's body is. It was male sexologists at the beginning of the 20th century who promoted the idea that female inverts, as we were called then, were really men born inside female bodies. And of course, this was taken up by Radcliffe Hall, even though she didn't believe in it, in order to get, she thought it was a way to get acceptance for lesbians. If this is, you know, if you can't help it, then it's all right. That was her line in The Well of Loneliness. But in second wave lesbian feminism, the idea of lesbians as really men was fundamentally eliminated. Gender, masculinity and femininity were understood as social constructions defined mainly by men. Femininity was understood as a means to oppress and limit women's freedom, keep us in our place and existing only to service male needs. And I would like to remind women here that at the beginning of the women's liberation movement, femininity in terms of clothing was one of the first things that the women's liberation movement took on. And we objected to being sex objects. In the States, they burnt makeup, girdles, bras, and so on. But in this country, we had the Miss World protest, which is basically all protesting about compulsory femininity and by that the objectification of women. Why does being a boy or defining as non-binary is so attractive to young lesbians? I think we get the answer to these questions when we look at the many lesbian detransitioners, and there are a lot of them now. in a survey of over 200 women who transitioned in their late teens and then detransitioned, mostly in their late 20s, nearly 70% said it was to escape misogyny. The reason they found becoming a boy, so-called, was to escape misogyny, mainly from other male pupils, and often highly sexualised misogyny. Fewer numbers said that they'd had mental health problems as teenagers, which were never addressed by gender identity clinics or any of the psychologists or psychiatrists they saw. By adopting a male persona and appearance, by taking hormones, binding their breasts, and sometimes having their breasts cut off, young lesbians can see it as a means of avoiding misogyny, which is often so sexualised. But it should be noted that very few of these young lesbians, and that's really what they are, US statistics call the research can't be done here because it's seen as transphobic. But in the US, it's been found that 95 to 100% of young women who trans, and this research was done on 21 to 24-year-olds, I think, were same-sex attracted. In other words, they were lesbian. But anyway, even though, and we know, because certainly we've met in our own group, we've met lesbian detransitioners who've talked to us about this, and that a lot of these women who call themselves boys or men do actually live with other women and live as lesbians below the radar, if you like. And then even though some of them may mutilate themselves in terms of having their breasts cut off and so on, very, very few of them will undertake female genital, what is basically female genital mutilation, or have their clitorises removed. So what is actually being taught? Okay, what is actually being taught? Well, I was going to show you some slides about what is actually being taught in schools about transgenderism and so on. Schools don't, at this point in time, actually have to have policies, transgender policies, or to teach about transgenderism. It's down to the schools themselves whether they have policies, and at this point actually have lessons on transgenderism as part of PHSE or whatever. What they do have to do is try and avoid unlawful discrimination. And this approach has been relentlessly promoted by trans organisations and those LGBT groups such as Stonewall. So if a pupil self-identifies as the opposite sex, basically schools are told that the approach must be total acceptance without question. And there's now government guidelines which actually support this. And this is without, as Linda has pointed out, and she's not here, without any legal change in terms of the law on gender identity having ever been passed. And what does this mean for other students? A government-sponsored anti-bullying programme for secondary schools on transphobia and homophobia tells these students, in terms of transphobia, that if they don't accept a girl who calls herself a boy, they are committing a hate crime and could be charged with that by the police. So school students are being terrified into accepting girls girls who define as boys, but they know really as girls because you can't actually change sex, and they continue to look female, for using the wrong pronouns. And we know this has happened to a number of teachers who've been called before disciplinary committees for using the wrong pronoun in terms of a trans pupil. So we can see that schools themselves are now institutions which are being used to police and enforce trans ideology. Many schools have been flooded with books and lesson materials on teaching schools about transgenderism. There are free storybooks for nurseries provided by a charity called Educate and Celebrate. You might also read about the drag queen in Bristol who was invited to come and read stories and perform for 3-year-old nursery children, because children need to know. That was the
about lesbians, though.
No, they don't need to know about lesbians, exactly. And I was going to show you materials which are taught to 11-year-olds, but I can't do that either. What I can do is when we get together the talks from this event, is circulate the slides to you so you can actually see the horrendous stuff that is actually being taught. I mean, girls with pink brains, boys with blue brains. Sometimes biology gets it wrong. It's all presented so simplistically. There's a video of a doctor saying that it can be easily fixed. If you're a girl who's got the brain of a boy, we can fix this. It's so easy to change sex. And then showing happy, joyful transgender women and men in videos.
Lynne.
Yeah. Okay. And needless to say, there are no teaching programmes which talk about sexuality or which show positive images of lesbians or happy lesbian young women. There are usually no positive images of lesbian presented in school. In fact, the word is rarely used. The one teaching programme that has been promoted by the government to address homophobic bullying alongside transphobic bullying, made in conjunction with Stonewall, only represents lesbians as conventionally feminine and who talk about themselves as gay. Those lesbians who reject femininity are totally missed out, and instead, surprise, surprise, are represented in these case materials as boys. We now have men as lesbians going into schools, doing diversity talks. I don't know if any of you saw that television Transgender Children, The Correct Approach or something on ITV. Well, some of the men that go into schools self-defining as lesbians and saying that they are lesbians. What sort of message is that giving to young girls? What sort of role models is that providing? That a man in a frock goes in and says that I'm a lesbian. No wonder girls don't want to be lesbians. In effect, what schools are doing, not all schools, but a lot of them, are imposing compulsory heterosexuality on many gender non-conforming young women who would previously have identified as lesbians. They are saying it's unacceptable to be lesbians and have relationships with the other young women. So in order to have a relationship with another young woman, you have to become a boy, and then you will conform to heterosexual norms, and it could be all right. I just want to say very shortly about the lesbian youth groups. In the 1980s, there were loads of lesbian youth groups around the country. As far as I know, there are no lesbian youth groups that exist now.
We need to, if
Yeah.
we're going to have any discussion.
I just want to finish very quickly, just to tell you about the reality of lesbian erasure. And this is literally, in the according to the whatever it's called, the Survey on National Statistics, they state that, according to their data, 1 in 50 women describe themselves as lesbians. In the 1980s, this was 1 in 10. And that was an underestimate. So, literally, lesbians don't exist by 40% or something. They're saying women who call themselves lesbians, 1 in 50. And this is actually terrible, I think. So that lesbians, as lesbians, we're being wiped out, and this needs to change. And I don't think we can be complacent about this. We really have to start fighting back and be much more visible, be visible in schools and so on. Go into schools and do what those men are doing, only actually we are the real lesbians, and we have to say that.